Can you remember me? My name's Kieran Gibb.
And I'm Aisha.
And we're working with Ivor Simpson. We're here to talk to you today about kind of methods that can more kind of holistically integrate information over space and time with respect to kind of soundscape data. So kind of over the last few years, many of you will be familiar with kind of these new remote sensing technologies in environmental monitoring. So we've got kind of camera traps, we've got LiDAR, and we've also got audio monitoring. And these are kind of being used to kind of help trying to build a kind of more holistic maps of kind of what's going on in space and time in ecosystems. So kind of wanted to tell you about audio. So audio is this really great source of information about what's going on in the sound, about what's going on in habitats, because it gives us this kind of both vertical information, so from the top of the canopy all the way to below the ground, and it gives us this horizontal information, so across different habitat types, across different vegetation densities and different kind of species populations. And then we can kind of use, so the idea is that we can use the audio recordings to kind of embed them into some kind of metric, right? So we have these kind of deep learned features is one option. There's also these kind of linear measures, acoustic indices, which are very commonly used in this area. And the idea is that we can use this to predict species community composition, for example, or species richness. And this works pretty well in a lot of cases. And I'd invite you to come and talk to me, or maybe it's a bit late now, about my poster, but if you're more interested in this area more, then I'd go next door. So yeah, the takeaway is that we can actually do this. Like these metrics do work. So what we're kind of here to talk to you today about is like how often, when, and like where should we be doing this kind of sampling, right? So kind of spatial analyses typically recommend we sample on a regular grid. And temporally, we kind of typically in this kind of area, we sample periodically. So, and that's again uniform. So 1 every 15 minutes is one standard recommendation. But habitats are not heterogeneous, and they're not uniformly distributed in space. And temporal resolution is typically determined by kind of diurnal and seasonal cycles, right? The species community as well, and the behavior of that particular community, and the structure of the habitat, and so forth. And then there's kind of loads of other like factors that are going to affect this, right? So there's issues potentially with oversampling, or we might end up with pseudo-replication problems. There's often the case, for example, where you don't necessarily know where exactly you should put the recorder. Maybe you need to move the recorder. Maybe certain places, if you wanted to put them on a regular grid, are not accessible, right? So we have kind of this problem where they're not always in the same place. And then recorders break, right? So the batteries die all the time. We lose data, so we end up with kind of gaps in our picture. So we want to try and be able to fill in these gaps, right? So one of the questions we're asking really is like, how much is enough, right? How often do we need to sample to get enough information to help describe what's going on in the soundscape? How much can we sparsify this process? And can we fill in the gaps in the data? I've taken way too much time. Sorry, here's Aisha.
Yeah, so I'm here to talk about implicit neural representations, which is this new sort of fancy tool that has evolved over the last couple of years. And what it is basically a fully connected neural network that serves as like a memory efficient representation of your data. So I'm going to talk about it, like to give some context, we'll look at it from an image domain, right? So what you have here is that you have some this neural network fits your data as some form of function. So if you're looking at it as an image where you have your pixel values represented on a fixed, regularly spaced grid, the input to your INR here would be the XYZ coordinates of your image, and then an output would be the pixel value, the intensity of the pixel of that particular image, which is basically the blue dots, the blue box there. So this INR has been used in lots of contexts. For example, 3D modeling, and personally I've used it in a more complex setting to predict like disease progression over a period of time. And here we're looking at basically how it comes into play in soundscape. So this is what a graphical representation of our architecture, where we have as an input to the INR is the spatial temporal coordinates. So here, theta and phi here are the latitude and longitude representing the location of your recorder. And T here is the time in which that particular recording was taken. And we have other inputs such as vegetation structure, which is a measure of greenness of that particular location. So we pass all these as inputs to the INR, and in turn it predicts soundscape descriptors, which could include histograms, latent features from a deep learning model, or even acoustic indices that Kieran spoke about. So here what we're trying to see is that we want to see how can we sort of derive can we derive a more reasonable sampling protocol, where in space here we can sample in time, which is on the left there, and we can also sample in space, and in essence we're able to predict both in time and space these latent features. So we can predict latent features from our deep learning model. We can predict acoustic indices based on these specific sampling protocols. And as a means of evaluation, we see if these predictions are able to predict soundscape community, which is presence or absence of a particular species in a habitat. So here what we're doing is we're trying to see, can we ask questions like, so once our data has been fitted to the INR as a function, right? We see if spatially we can ask questions like how far apart should the recordings be, and how many recordings are sufficient. And temporally we can ask questions like how far apart these recordings are collected and the duration of each recording. Basically, we're trying to see if we are able to derive more efficient sampling protocols, because if we have things like for temporal samplings, right, we can have things where in the afternoon we would want to derive a more reasonable sampling protocol at specific time points, because we have like more human activities at that particular time. So yeah, I'll hand back to Kieran.
So just to give you a little taste of what we have vaguely working. So this is kind of just an initial sample. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a map of the NEP estate. So this is an audio data set that was collected in 2015. And so each of the blue markers is a particular location. And so we fitted the INR basically using this to predict the soundscape descriptors at the particular locations, right? So, and this is just us interpolating basically. We defined a continuous space over this region, and we're interpolating through space and in time. And so the metric here is predicting the acoustic complexity index, which is a kind of a way of, that was designed to kind of detect bird species. So yeah, this is kind of just, it's very, very early prototype, but you know, we got something kind of working, which is exciting. But the really great thing is we can start to ask more interesting questions of this kind of model, like how do habitats change across different areas, right? Can it kind of start to detect these kind of transition points in space and time? And also, can we kind of start to fill in the gaps in some of this data? Because we can verify this, you know, by saying, well, can you predict the species community, for example? So yeah, scaling up, right? So can we start to fill in the gaps? And then can we start to leverage data from different sources? You can imagine, right, where, you know, academic institutions like ourselves are collecting kind of this data quite densely. Then you've got these kind of larger, longer-term monitoring programs that are distributed over larger areas and are starting to establish longer-term kind of monitoring setups. And then there's kind of all this distributed kind of snapshots that are captured from around the world where, you know, individuals are kind of taking particular recordings. So can we scale up to look at this, to build a holistic representation of the soundscape at a global scale? Right? This is going to give us a much richer insight into what's really going on and a better insight into ecological processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kieran and Aisha. Any questions?
Hey, thank you. That was a really cool talk. So two really quick things. So as someone that doesn't know about this, are implicit neural representations, is that the same kind of technology as neural radiance fields for 3D modeling? That's the first part. And the second part, what is the ground truth that you use for comparing your sampling strategies?
So I'll talk about the implicit neural representations. So these are like MLPs basically. So these are multi-layered perceptrons, and within each of them we have like nonlinear activation functions, right? But for this specific instance, we use like the siren model, which the nonlinear activation function is a sine function. And the reason why the paper that came out was like the siren, and the reason why they chose that particular activation function over like ReLU was because using things like ReLU, you have these spectral bias where low frequency components are not captured. But then with this kind of nonlinear activation function, with the sine function, we have that it's able to capture both low and high frequency components. So yeah. And with the
So with regards to kind of ground truthing it, what we're kind of doing is so we have this audio data collected over time and space, right? And what we can do at the moment is we can train on subsets, right? So we can say, oh well, we're only going to show the INR these recorders. We can look at different arrangements in space, right? So we can do some kind of cross-validation on that. So we can hold out different sets. And we can do the same with time, right? So we can look progressively. Do we hold out, we've got recordings every 15 minutes, but we can hold out, test set points where they're like 30 minutes out of a 45 or an hour. And then, because we can actually compute the prediction of the species community because we have the labels at the moment. So we can then actually check to see if these features that are interpolated based on it haven't actually seen those recordings, whether they're real or not, whether it actually works. I've also, some of my work is looking at kind of using, if we're predicting latent features from some of my work, then we can generate spectrograms using a generative model. So we can actually look at what the kind of the interpolated features, what it thinks it sounds like in those places, which is really a really great outcome. Anybody else?
I think we're going to have to wrap up there. Thank you very much. Next up.